On this episode of Amor al Migrante podcast, we have a very special guest, Justice David Chew, a native El Pasoan who served many years as Chief Justice of the 8th Court of Appeals of Texas.
You can't build a wall high enough to keep people out if they really want to come for the benefit of their families. And
Right.
so it's disheartening that we have so many people. It's kind of like we've reinstated the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now it's
Right.
it's the OTM Exclusion Act.
Essentially, this is what we would recognize now as asylum seekers, right?
Right.
Like they're in a war-torn country.
It's time to encourage El Paso and other border communities to have more Chew in their DNA.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So we can have more people like your grandmother, your mom, your dad, your grandfather, and yourself who fight for what's right, who fight for the voiceless, and who fight for a better place.
Welcome to another episode of Amor al Migrante. Today we have a very special guest joining us, Justice David Chew, a native El Pasoan who served many years as Chief Justice of the 8th Court of Appeals of Texas. Today we're going to dive into the Chew family legacy here in El Paso. A really fascinating story. There's a lot been shared and a lot been told about this. So we kind of wanted to jump on that and talk a little bit about that during the family's legacy during the Chinese Exclusion Act and in future generations. Justice Chew will talk about your grandmother, Erlinda Chew, who was born in Mexico, and I would call heroic, a true trailblazer, literally saved hundreds of lives during the Mexican Revolution and beyond. So I think this is going to be a really, really fascinating conversation.
Absolutely. And on this episode, we'll be talking about Pancho Villa, family visits to China, the different cultural barriers that came with those visits, and taking a look at the discrimination many immigrants faced during the exclusion of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and what we can learn from that now and see what is it that we can what mistakes cannot be repeated from the past in today's date. So welcome, Justice Chew. It's a pleasure for us to have you in this podcast, and I guess we can go ahead and dive right into the questions. Enjoying this podcast? For almost 40 years, Estrella del Paso has supported over 500 clients from 80 different countries thanks to people like you. And your support keeps this work going. During these critical times, help us continue by donating at estrelladelpaso.org. And that's it. Back to the podcast. So the first one is, of course, tell us a little bit about yourself, how your family ended up in our border, and a little bit of background.
Well, let me start first with my grandfather, which is his Mexican name was Antonio Yi Chew, but his Chinese name was Yi Wing Chew. He was born in Canton, in the Cantonese area of China, and like many of the hundreds of thousands of Chinese from that region, was one of the sojourners who traveled to Mexico. We think he arrived in Mexico probably right around the turn of the century, about 1905, thereabouts. We don't have too many details about how he ended up in Juarez, but we know he was in Juarez about sometime in probably 1910, 1911. We know he's there in 1913 because that's when he married Erlinda. My grandmother, Erlinda Chew, her Chinese name was Sun Far Wong. Her father was a Chinese who immigrated to Mexico, married Francisca Vasquez, who was a indigenous Mexican Indian. She bragged to her daughters that she was actually an Aztec princess, but we think that's a little bit of a hype since the Aztecs had pretty much been, that was about 500 years too late. So while she may have been of Aztec descent, I don't think she can establish that she was a princess.
Right.
Although I think in her mind, she did act like she was a princess, and she was a very bold lady. She ended up we don't know the circumstances, but she arrived in Juarez, Ciudad Juarez, and was there at the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. And we know this is documented. There are a number of portraits or postcards that were made, photos that were made for the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. So a number of them published. And as people may not know, is that the social media of the day were postcards. And so the photographers took pictures of different things. The Mexican Revolution was a very favorite topic. And she was featured with her rifle, bandolera, and binoculars in one case.
I
Nice.
love it.
and that was documented about 1911. And there was another gentleman from El Paso, another famous El Pasoan, Califos Calleros, who was knew Herlinda and actually worked. They played together, and that's why these photos were taken, along with one of the Schwartz brothers, who was there, as a youngster. At any rate, Herlinda and Antonio married and began kind of a Chew presence in the Ciudad Juarez area. And of course, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which had been enacted in 1882, they were not able to immediately come to the United States, but they ran a Chinese grocery, a pretty successful one, in Juarez, and they were leaders of the Chinese colony in Juarez. They formed numerous organizations to work with the Chinese, who actually outnumbered the number of Chinese in El Paso. There were more Chinese in Ciudad Juarez than there were in El Paso at that time. I'm trying to think in the order. One of the first things that came up is that that we discovered, again, I thought it was a myth, but it came out to be true, is that in 1919, during the third battle of Juarez, of the Mexican Revolution, Herlinda was able to convince the American authorities to provide shelter to initially 150 Chinese. It ultimately ended up being more than 200 Chinese. Were paroled into the United States, and we don't know exactly where they were sheltered, but at the bridge, so that when the battle of Juarez began, those Chinese were safe. This was all due to the enmity of Pancho Villa, who did not like Chinese at all, and in particular had participated in the massacre of others Chinese throughout that time period. And anyway, so they were in Juarez during that time, but in 1921, my grandmother, who had apparently contact with the immigration authorities and worked as almost a travel broker to help people, Mexican or Chinese, enter into El Paso under bond because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, so that they could travel back to China to fulfill one of their duties as a sojourner. And but in 1921, they were able to establish that they qualified for one of the exceptions to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And they traveled to Calexico, California. They were allowed to enter in El Paso, but under bond, go by train on the Southern Pacific train to Calexico, where they crossed back into Mexicali, so that they could then come back to Calexico and were admitted as merchants, Chinese merchants. And that was Herlinda, Antonio, and their 4 children, including my father, who was 2 years old at the time. And they ended up settling in El Paso and actually ran the 2 stores. The grocery store in Juarez was continued on, and their store in El Paso was the New China, which they ultimately had 3 stores. But the one primary store was a New China of Stanton and Overland. Building's still there, by the way. And so then they became leaders of the Chinese who were in El Paso and were very prominent. My grandmother in particular was a very influential, joined a number of organizations. So was on the Better Business Bureau for El Paso. Ultimately, they had a wholesale that provided wholesale services to other Chinese groceries in the area. Anyway, that's how they got to El Paso.
That's fascinating.
Right.
What a story. There's so much to dive into in that portion that you just told us there. But first, just how impressive that is. You're talking about all these things that she was involved in. We're talking early 1900s. So for a woman to be involved in businesses and all of these different organizations and to take such a role in helping others, I think that's pretty impressive.
Yes, it is.
Definitely a person of great character, and she was very articulate. She spoke Spanish, English, Chinese, and some French. And so she was very, very, I think she probably could be very intimidating.
I mean, she had all this knowledge, but she wasn't the one to keep the knowledge to herself. She shared with the people, with the community.
Mhm.
So she was, in a sense, inviting because people were asking for her help. You know, she was posing for bonds, she was helping translation, she was doing a bunch of stuff. So, like you said, it could be intimidating, but in a sense, like, okay, she might be intimidating, but let me go because I need her help because she knows where to go,
Right,
what to do in the
exactly.
process. So that's just amazing and impressive.
Talking about, let's go back to the port where you said it was initially 150 Chinese people from Mexico during the Mexican Revolution that she brought over. When I was reading about that, I was thinking, essentially, this is what we would recognize now as asylum seekers, right?
Right.
Like they're in a war-torn country. There is a risk of them being persecuted because of where they are from, because of who they are. And I think that's really important to talk about in terms of providing some context, right? And making the link to 100 years later,
Absolutely.
kind of people seeking that same safety. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, because they during let me go back to prior to the 1919, the La Garantía was the store that they operated in Juarez, and in addition to the Garantía, we're pretty convinced that our grandfather or the business also participated in supplying supplies and goods to the Persian expedition, which was had taken place. And so there was, again, a great deal of enmity against Chinese, like it was in the United States, because the Chinese Exclusion Act. Mexico was having the same issues with Chinese in Mexico, and there were a number, again, massacres. The Pancho Villa's forces, though, were in the area, and they frequented the grocery store, and they gave them warning, some of these soldiers, that the battle was going to begin at midnight on that day in 1919. And it was at that time that my grandmother went to the immigration authorities and obtained advance permission for asylum seekers, basically, to be paroled into the United States, and so that they could wait out the battle, which they did. And at midnight, the battle began, and she had already escorted 150 Chinese men, women, and not there weren't that many women, but there were men and women and children, including my parents and my father and my uncles and aunts, to the bridge, the Paso del Norte bridge, and that's where they took shelter. And to the credit of those officials, they were provided parole and amnesty. Upwards of 200 people ultimately were given shelter there. Again, when my aunts told me that story, I said, "Oh, that's got to be just a story." But
Right.
we've come across actually documentation, articles in the newspaper that were contemporaneous to that event, and they called her the Chinese queen, the queen of the Chinese, for helping those 100 or 200 Chinese seek asylum. It's not clear how long they were there, but they ultimately, everybody returned as was promised back to Ciudad Juarez to begin, start again whatever businesses they were in. But they were, as you mentioned, granted asylum, provided asylum, and protected from that situation. So very well in today's world today, as we speak today, it's not so good a situation. So it's
Right.
There was a time where we were like what she was doing.
And
Sorry,
just a little parenthesis, you might have heard the name Herlinda Chew, and it's because we have a street actually, right? I think it's on the east side of El Paso. So if you might have heard that before, it's because we have an actual street on the name of Herlinda Chew Way. So just throwing that parenthesis out there. Yes.
No, it's amazing. I think that what's really interesting about talking about this is seeing the parallels, right, of the situation and understanding the similarity in the circumstances, and how once upon a time, even up to very recently, our country responded in a certain way in those situations, right? And so I think that it's important to recognize those parallels, and that this is something that has been happening at our borders for generations. This has been going on for a really long time. So I think that that's what's really interesting to see. This is not a new phenomenon to this area, to international borders, to kind of what's happening here. So that's super interesting. I also read something about the trips that your family and your grandmother would take back to China to help Mexican women who were there. And that's another interesting facet there.
Well, because of my grandmother's, my grandparents' relationship with the Southern Pacific Railroad, they were, I guess we would call travel brokers. They and their relationship with the Immigration Service, they would arrange for mostly men to fulfill their obligations as sojourners to go back to China periodically to take their earnings back to China and see family. And so they had a pretty close relationship with not only the Southern Pacific Railroad, but also with the what is now today the American President Line, or the ship lines. And so they were able to travel back courtesy as part of their earnings. They would travel back, particularly my grandmother, travel back to China on numerous occasions. And usually my grandmother would take about half of the kids. By that time they had 8 children, would take half of them would go back and go to school in China, and they'd stay for about a year. And during that time, Herlinda would, come across wives, Mexican wives, of these Chinese that had gone back to China, and who were, in a sense, abandoned in China by their husbands, and were not recognized as legitimate in China. And so she would help arrange for their transport to return back to to Mexico, to their homeland. And I think she made probably about 6 to 8 of these trips over the course of her life. Again, some were shorter, some were longer. The one she made was almost a year long. She stayed in there for about a year. So she was, again, a frequent traveler and a frequent travel broker, and she did help these women return to Mexico. And so that's one of her legacies that we're very proud of. Unfortunately, she contracted tuberculosis, and in the 1930s, there was no cure for tuberculosis. There wasn't.
Right.
She just went to a sanitarium and essentially just passed away, and she died at a very young age. And her husband died within 6 months after her death in 1936. So she was only 56 years old when she died. And so their lives were very, very short, relatively speaking, today.
Right.
But as you know, and well, my father, Wellington, was she had always had aspirations that he would become a lawyer, and he ultimately did become a lawyer, although it was not directly, because he was actually went to Texas A&M and was in the Corps of Cadets, the Corps of Cadets, and was studying chemical engineering. But because he was Chinese, when World War II began, he was not going to be able to be commissioned, even if he'd completed his classes. And when he was a junior, he was drafted into the Army and went on to fight in World War II in Normandy, the Battle of Paris, and the Battle of the Bulge. But when he returned to the United States, he went, instead of going back to Texas A&M to become an engineer, he wanted to become a lawyer. And so he was able to, because of the GI Bill, like many El Pasoans who did serve in the Army, were able to avail themselves of the GI Bill and went to law school. And there are probably half a dozen very prominent El Paso lawyers of that era that went to the same school. A number of them were judges, and Wellington, again, started practicing in El Paso in 1951. He was the first Chinese American lawyer.
Nice.
Interesting, he was, after he finished his infantry replacement training, right before he went to Normandy, he was naturalized. And this was actually, he was naturalized several months before the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed.
Wow.
So it's possible that his citizenship was perhaps avoidable, but it was never challenged. So
Nice.
fortunately, and of course now, had that been the case, we might be in trouble as being under our current Trump's proposal to do away with birthright citizenship. We might have
Right.
an issue, but
Right.
it's probably too late for us.
Right.
So he left a mark, and he was as an immigration lawyer. He's pretty well known as an immigration lawyer, and that was how I became an immigration lawyer. It was because unfortunately he passed away while I was in law school, and but the immigration judges put all of his cases in the file cabinet, knowing that I was coming home.
Nice.
And
Amazing.
so as soon as the day after I got my notice that I had passed the bar and was a lawyer, I was called up by Judge Weinert, who was one of the immigration judges, and said, "You have a case set for next week. Get ready."
Oh, wow.
Welcome to the law world.
Welcome to the law. So that's how I ended up doing a lot of immigration work, other things as well, but mostly immigration. And then my sister joined me, Linda Chew, and Patricia Chew came back as well, and all of us were immigration lawyers, predominantly. So.
And talk about having a DNA on I guess advocacy and fighting for justice, right? It comes right from your grandparents, and then your mom and dad, and then now you have it, your sisters too. It's just like the whole lineup on the family tree. It's photos of you guys, and then justice sign next to your photos in that. Man, it's just amazing. I was reading actually that your grandfather has a senior center, right, in El Paso. It's Wellington Chew Senior Center.
That's my father. That's
Your
Wellington.
father.
Wellington. Yeah, my father, Wellington Chew, had a senior citizen center named after him in Northeast El Paso, which is where we grew up. We grew up in Northeast El Paso, so we're very proud of that center too. And that's one of the.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the most popular senior citizens centers in El Paso. At least it was when I was there.
No, absolutely.
I was really proud of that. I also grew up in Northeast El Paso, so I'm actually an Andres High School grad, but my sister is a teacher at Urban High School, so I graduated from Urban. So I just thought that was really cool. People from the Northeast love the Northeast, but sometimes we're forgotten about. But we are out there, guys.
Right. Long live the Northeast. Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, Northeast El Paso was an interesting area of El Paso because it was so. At least when I was there in the 50s and 60s, most of my friends and classmates were somehow either associated with Fort Bliss or civil service, and so there was a great diversity of folks. In fact, I really never even understood I was Chinese until I went to the Naval Academy, and then I found out I was Chinese. But back when I was in high school, we were just kind of a homogenous group of kids, and no one paid any attention to whether they were Mexican or Spanish or Chinese or Black or whatever, or German. It was all we were all just growing up in Northeast El Paso.
That was my experience too. That's definitely my experience. That was in the 90s, early 2000s, attending middle school and high school. That was definitely my experience too. And you were talking about the businesses in the Northeast. And I think that is also that your grandparents had. And I think that's a big part of the legacy and really a big part of what we promote when it comes to immigration, right? Is that is helpful to our community. That is a contribution to our community when immigrants come, when they start businesses, when they offer services that our communities are in need of. And that was a direct contribution that your family made to this community.
Well, and they had the Chinese, the New China was in El Paso. They had New China 1, New China 2, and New China 3. And then they had the Western Grocery, which is on Texas Street. Was on Texas Street. And the building, all of these buildings are still in existence.
Nice.
And in fact, I can't remember the address, I think it's 1818 Texas. I think the sign is painted sign over on the brick is still visible next time you're down there. I think the city's moved into that building. One of the city hall buildings. But they were, and particularly my grandmother was very active in the Pilot, which is an civic organization of women. She was part of the better business community, and received tributes on her death from what would normally be a very conservative, very business-like organization. But she was very, very much a part of that, and very much a voice that was listened to.
Why? I mean, you talked about that your grandmother wanted one of her children to become a lawyer, and your father did that, and then you and your siblings kind of went down the same path. Why would you say, on a personal level, that that's something that was so important to you to pursue?
Well, I kind of took a side trip, and that is I went to the Naval Academy initially, and was able to. Well, I wanted to quit after the first year, but my mother wouldn't let me. She said, you wanted to do this, so now you have to stay. So actually, I was trying to, anyway, I did graduate, and I was commissioned as a naval officer. And I was pretty much on a career path to stay in the Navy. But there came a time when you reached that fork in the road where you need to decide whether you stay or do something else. And there was that connection with my father to become a lawyer as well, and to join him in practice. And frankly, had he died before I got out of the Navy, I would have stayed in the Navy. But I left the Navy, went to law school, and so I took that fork, and that's how I ended up, becoming a lawyer. But it was to join him, and it was with the expectation I would join him. Didn't quite work out that way, but I still tried to step into his shoes, which I couldn't fill, but I tried to. And so it was again a good, I had a good professional career as an immigration lawyer. I worked with his partner or associate was a young man named Paul Douglas. Paul worked with my dad for a number of years, and when my dad died, again when I was in law school, Paul paid the rent on my father's office.
Wow.
Kept the office going, knowing I was coming home, and so it was a great deal of that. Added a great deal to Paul Douglas, who helped me along the way, and was kind of that direct connection to my father's practice, and so I'm deeply indebted there. And that became Douglas and Chew, and then Douglas, Chew and Chew, and my sister Linda joined us, and we were in those days we were the kind of the premier immigration firm in El Paso. We did a lot of deportation work. That was one of our specialties. At that time, it was mostly working with the Mexican citizens, but occasionally there would be I guess they still use the term OTM, other than Mexican. Nowadays, they don't use that term very often because it's become more. The majority are OTMs, other than Mexicans. But our practice was mostly Mexican, but we did deal with asylum seekers. There weren't that many that we had to do with, but we still did a lot of that. Again, in those days, we had a number of remedies that were available. We had suspension of deportation. We had 212C waivers. So there were a lot of things we could do or try to do. And all of the immigration judges at that point in time were very, very fair. And as time went on, by the time I left the practice of law and went on to the court, it was starting to be a little more adversarial and a little more contested. And unfortunately, sometimes Border Patrol agents are not quite as courteous as they ought to be. So it is it was sometimes a difficult situation to be in, but that's what lawyers are for, is to take on those challenges, as you all do. It's needed, and of course the predecessor organization was very much involved in that, and we worked alongside that. I've got a couple of plaques from the diocese of the migrant, refugee, and
Diocesan Migrant and Refugee Services.
Services,
yes.
Yeah. DRMCS, yes. I'm trying to think of some of the names of some of the folks that they've all retired, I'm sure by now, but they were good folks, and they worked well.
Considering your work that you've done, that your family has done, your sisters have done immigration work, you've done immigration work, considering kind of what has happened through the generations of your family, What can you say about what you've seen, how you've seen the landscape of immigration change over these decades?
It's certainly not gotten any better. And in recent months, it's gotten really horrible.
Yeah.
But it's, as my father used to say, there's not a wall you can't build a wall high enough to keep people out if they really want to come for the benefit of their families. And
Right.
so it's disheartening that we have so many people. It's kind of like we've reinstated the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now it's
Right.
it's the OTM Exclusion Act, or OTA, I guess you say.
Other than Americans.
Other than American, we don't want you, and that's really a shame. And it's really, hurts. It's a shame, and it's very disheartening that we're in that situation today.
Right. And especially because going through your family line, right? Like your grandmother, she was able to talk to, I guess, what it was, CBP or Border Patrol back in the day, and make an arrangement. You know what? This is going to happen in the city. We need your help. Can you help us during this time before the revolution? And Pancho Villa went into town and started that Juarez war, and I think we should apply the same concept to today's date. Is just by conversation and acknowledging that people go through struggles and go through hard times, and there's persecution in other countries. And if you go to South America, if you go to Europe, if you go to Asia, like there's persecution, Middle East, everywhere. And by having the conversation and acknowledging that people go through struggles, I think would open up the eyes of most of the people who are against supporting and helping those who need the help. And I think that's something that we could apply to today's date. The fact that let's open our eyes, our ears, and our heart and acknowledge that people go through struggles. And this is our time to help, because we don't know when we're going to need their help later on, because, life comes around. And I mean, back in the day, we're the Chinese, now we're people from South America, Latin America, and it could be down the road, it could be Americans, U.S. citizens that need the help from people of other countries because something happens here. Right. So I think that's something that we need to point that out. And I also wanted to highlight your mom, because I read that she was one of the first female school principals in El Paso. So I just wanted to highlight that. It's like the whole family tree. Once again I touch on that. The whole family tree is just like very impressive and so like encouraging for others.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the women of the family have done very well for themselves, and it made us all very proud. So that was Patricia, my mother, Patricia, and she was one of the first female principals. She was principal at Travis Elementary School.
Nice.
Which I think it's still exists. I know there was some talk about they were going to merge it with something, but I think Travis still exists. I'm not positive. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all very much for this. It's been very enjoyable.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we haven't asked you that you'd like to talk about, that you'd like to add, just in terms of making that parallel through what we saw with the Chinese Exclusion Act? I know you touched on it briefly, and just kind of what there is to be learned from it.
It was a dark chapter in, I think, immigration history, laws of the United States, and it reflects, in many cases, kind of some of the attitudes that you were just talking about, Christian. That people have a tendency to, unfortunately, exhibit a lot of racism in the United States, and we're not as far along as I thought we were. Some years ago, I thought we were closer to being more unified, but I guess that's too woke for some people, and unfortunately, they're not woke enough. So haven't awoken to the issues and the real issues. So it's kind of we're living in some very difficult times right now, very scary. So we'll see what happens.
Right. So I guess it's time to encourage El Paso and other border communities to have more Chew in their DNA.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So we can have more people like your grandmother, your mom, your dad, your grandfather, and yourself, who fight for what's right, who fight for the voiceless, and who fight for a better place and safety for others.
Absolutely. We definitely appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today to go down this little historical memory lane
Right,
here
interesting.
and kind of making that connection with what we're seeing now. So I think that that's important to remember for our community, and we are happy to have you here.
Yes.
All
So I
right.
guess-
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us, and for the people who's watching the podcast, thank you once again for joining in a new episode of Amor al Migrante podcast, and we'll see you guys the next time. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
This is the Amor al Migrante podcast, Love for the Migrant, a project of Estrella del Paso, the largest provider of free immigration legal services in West Texas and southern New Mexico. This podcast is coming to you from El Paso, Texas, hosted by Sandra Ramirez and Cristian Trujillo. Please subscribe to the Amor al Migrante podcast to be alerted about new episodes, and visit www.estrelladelpaso.org to support our work on the southern border.